Hello and welcome to Photographic Connections, the podcast where we create connection to self, nature and others through the art of photography. My name is Kim Grant, the founder of Photographic Connections and your host for this podcast. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Chris Murray onto the podcast. Chris is a landscape photographer based in upstate New York. We speak about the importance of being authentic to yourself and creating photographs that align with you, as well as how books have played a massive part in inspiring him in his photographic journey, and how using your emotions to create your images can lead to much more meaning in your photos. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chris Murray. Hi Chris, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast this week. You were recommended to me by one of our listeners, and the moment I looked at your website, I just knew instantly that you were going to be a great guest for this podcast. You've got such a deep connection to nature, and in all your imagery, you bring so much emotion into what you do. So before we delve deeper into that, I wondered if you would be happy to go back to the beginning of your journey and to explain what got you into photography in the first place.
Yeah, I don't think my story is too different from a lot of people. Unlike some, I wasn't born with a box brownie camera, in my hand. As a kid, I enjoyed taking pictures each summer. We'd be on summer vacation up in the Thousand Islands of upstate New York, where I live now. It's my favorite area. So I enjoyed taking pictures those weeks I was up there and getting the pictures back. I'd use my sister's old hand-me-down camera. And then even as a teenager, when I would go up there, I enjoyed taking pictures. But I never thought it was anything I was passionate about. And that continued into my 20s. On vacation, I would take pictures. My sister always had a real camera, a 35mm SLR with telephoto lenses and all that. And one year, we were together, and afterward, when I got home, she shared her pictures with me, and they're much better than mine because she had different lenses and things. I just had a point and shoot. So I thought, I want to get a real camera. And I did that. And I bought a book on photography, a John Shaw book on, basics of landscape photography, and something about that book just lit a fire under me. I can't explain why. It wasn't a groundbreaking book, but I saw the pictures and I can't really explain it. I just, from that point forward, wanted to make photos like I saw, deliberate, with intent, technically superb, real photos, not snapshots. It was weird. I can't explain it. It just lit something in me, and from that point forward, I knew what I wanted to do with my life.
Wow. It's incredible that a book had that effect on you. I think it can really show the power, can't it, of a creative piece and how it can affect some person to almost completely change the course of their life.
Yeah, strange. Yeah, he was for years, I've never met him, never taken a workshop with him, but I kind of considered him my first kind of mentor. And again, it wasn't like it was a groundbreaking book. I mean, it was a popular book. It's not like his approach was anything wild or different. I mean, this is in the pre-digital days, of course. This is the mid-90s. 95. I just, I had enjoyed photography, but it was nothing I really gave a second thought to. And then, I don't know, it just took off. And it was like a spark was ignited by that book. But by that point, I was in the final year of getting my PhD in geology. And so, the train was already well down the tracks. So, that's where my career was going to go, although I knew at that moment that this is really what I wanted to do with my life. And so it was just a matter of finding a way to do it at some point. So.
Gosh, that's amazing. And I'm guessing because you went to study geology, did you have a very deep connection to nature then from quite a young age?
I did. It's funny. I've met several other landscape photographers who were geologists, in their first careers. And it makes sense, right? You go into geology because why? You love nature, right? So it makes sense. So it's a natural, I think, progression. Like a lot of people, I went to college. I was good in science and math, and I did like nature. Again, I think the summers I spent with family on vacation up in the Thousand Islands, it's a very geologically interesting area, a lot of rock. Even though it's not that far from where I lived the rest of the year, it was different. And so I think that sparked my imagination and appreciation for nature. It's like I did a lot of camping growing up or a lot of hiking growing up. It was just really during the summertime. And so I had appreciation for nature, and it just seemed like geology at the time was the natural way to kind of marry those two. Although I knew it back then, I never loved geology. I liked it. I was interested in it. But I never loved it. However, you're in college, you have to figure out what you want to do with your life. All this money's being spent, so it just seemed like the way to go. Although looking back, I went to grad school for it, but it was a misfit. I wasn't a misfit. It was just me, and geology was not the right fit. It was just by default, I had to do something with my life, and it seemed like that was the thing to do. And I did it for a number of years, even professionally. But I knew photography was where my passion really lied. Not the science part. So, but there is definitely a connection there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there definitely is in many respects. Of course, the nature element and what you've kind of gone on to do with your work as well. And just, I guess, the intricacy in some ways, because with geology, you often have to look quite closely at your subject, don't you? And kind of identify things and look into them. And now you've kind of gone on with your photography to do a lot of I guess, deep thoughts within your work, and combine that with emotion. You can really see that you really think and connect with the scene around you. And you actually, you on your website, you've described yourself as a photographic artist. So where does the kind of artistic, I guess, realm come into your work?
Well, that's something that's relatively new to me. I mean, I don't have an art background of any kind. As most landscape photographers don't seem to, right? They seem to come from a different career, right? And that's different from many other artistic medium, painting and sculpting. They seem to have art degrees, all the way through. So we come into photography and landscape photography with no idea of, often, most of us do, of art. And for years, even as a photographer, when I was practicing it, I didn't consider myself an artist because I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't grow up in an artistic family. Particular artistic family, so it really wasn't over until the last 6-7 years. Everything kind of changed for me in 2015. I'm sure we'll probably get to that. But when I really discovered that there was an artistic side of photography, or what it can be, the potential for photography, I should say, and landscape photography. And since then, it's been just a journey of self-discovery. I know that sounds dramatic, but discovering the artist within. I was good at math and science, so I became a scientist. I figured that's who I was. Even going back 10 years ago, I wouldn't have considered myself an artist. I do now. And of course, artists, how you define that, we won't get into that's a whole, it's a big rabbit hole. But yeah, it's been interesting. You can be in your 50s now that I am and still discovering yourself and finding out who you truly are, so it's been fascinating. And actually, for years, when if I would ask myself, why I'm passionate about photography, I couldn't answer it adequately. I would say things like, oh, I love nature, and well, yeah, but there's a million different ways to enjoy nature, but why photography? Well, I think now it's, like I said, it's a journey of discovery, of who I am, and now it's how much of an artist can I be, or how much can I push my boundaries and limitations and in my work? And it's interesting. It's fascinating.
I think when we get more into the artistic realm of photography, like you kind of identified there, you really start to understand yourself more, because when you're very much in the technical process, it's kind of very methodical. You're doing step by step of what you're doing. You're creating these images that you maybe have been told, this composition makes a good image, this settings are the right for this condition. But when you actually go into the artistic world, you start to express yourself. That's where the expression comes from, and that's where you start to connect with the subject that really interests you. And I love this shift, because I feel like when I began photography, everyone spoke about the technicalities. But through doing this podcast, so many people are starting to speak about the creativity, the artistic side of it, and how it's really helped them to express themselves. And you'd mentioned something there about in 2015 there was a shift for you into this more artistic side of photography. So what happened then to cause this shift?
Well, again, I learned. I'm completely self-taught. I teach workshops, but I've never even taken a workshop myself. Seems ironic, but I had that book. I got Outdoor Photographer magazine back in the day. And this is when internet was just in the nascent days of the internet. So, I just knew what I learned from seeing in books, but the photos I was making, that was back in slide film days. I went digital in 2007. Most of them, if you had to categorize them, were very objective representation type of photographs, the scene as observed. Yes, there's some subjectivity in terms of framing and all that, but nothing wildly unique or different, just very objective representation. And a lot of landscape photography is that. And I didn't know it could be more than that. I didn't, up until even 2010, I hadn't even cracked a book on Ansel Adams. I just did not know the history of photography, nor did I seem to have an interest in learning it, which is kind of mind-boggling and kind of, embarrassing to admit now. But in 2015, and I'm sure you've heard maybe this before, I purchased a book, Guy Towell's first book, More Than a Rock. And that became my, for lack of a better term, Bible in a way. It was the beginning of just opening my eyes to not just what photography can be, but also what living the life of an artist can be. I didn't really know much about him. I got Outdoor Photographer magazine, and I remember seeing an article by him. That was the first time I'd seen his name, about 2 years before More Than a Rock came out. And so when I started to read it, it was different than any other article I'd seen in Outdoor Photographer. It wasn't about tips and tricks, and it wasn't about places to go for fall color and all that kind of stuff you see in that magazine. It was a typical Guy Towell type article. And my first reaction was, this is a bunch of hooey. It was philosophical, it was nebulous, it was different than anything I'd seen. And so my first reaction was, yeah, this is just a bunch of, but there's something about it that intrigued me. I read it a few times, didn't quite grasp it, but his name stuck with me. And when he put out a book, I thought, well, what the heck? Let's see what he's about. I read the introduction and I was hooked. That one page I saw me in it, the kind of photographer I had been up to that point, and then I saw what I could be. And it was a game changer. And that just then set me off. I'm going to read about, the history of photography and learning about all the big names, over the past 160, 70 years, and then, just learning not just about their work, but their philosophies on photography and art, and it was just a whole other side of photography that I had not been aware of. And then that started coming through in my photography, right? As you mentioned, it's about expression, right? And making more expressive, self-expressive photos. I changed the types of scenes I was photographing. It changed my approach to photographing them. Changed my experience in photographing them. I was your classic. Prior to that, there was as much frustration in my landscape photography as there was joy. Because I was results oriented. It was all about getting a photo. Forget the fact that I spent 3 hours in nature. If I didn't get a good photo out of it, I was frustrated the rest of the day. And so that results-oriented approach, as opposed to being more focused on the experience, and that's been a hard thing for me to learn, to let go of that results-oriented approach. It's not something you just turn off, and yeah. So it changed everything. It was a game changer, and I'm continuing to learn. It's just, but it was a huge shift, and by that point, I had been practicing landscape photography for 20 years. So it just took a while in coming. So.
Yeah, I think sometimes we need that, don't we? There's that shift of perspective, that new inspiration in many respects. And there seems to be a common theme here with you. A book was what got you into photography in the first place. Another book is what got you this transition into the more creative, artistic elements. And it does show the kind of importance, doesn't it, of these physical things that we read and we look at, and these where we get inspiration. Because I've not actually spoken to anybody yet who's got that inspiration necessarily from a book, but obviously it happens all the time. But it's interesting to hear that every almost transition for you within that has come from this physical books that you've picked up and almost been drawn to as well. Yeah. And you mentioned there about letting go of the almost expectation and the kind of need to get results every time you go out, and that was quite a process for you. There's a lot of people who really struggle to let go of that. I think we all, in our photography journeys, we struggle to let go of that. So do you think there was an epiphany for you one day as well that kind of allowed you to let go of that almost expectation, or was it a gradual process over many years?
It's been a gradual process, and I'm not 100% there. You know, I remember one instance going back, 9, 10 years ago. I was going to get up in the morning and go make photos. It was supposed to be a really beautiful morning. But for whatever reason, I was just too tired. I just couldn't get out of bed. Well, then, sure enough, it just turned out to be a spectacular sunrise. And I'm watching it from my window, and I was just overcome with frustration over a missed opportunity. But then it didn't take the time to really, well, and then that just ruined my mood for the rest of the day. I felt like I just missed out. But then it wasn't until years later I look back on it and I think, well, what did I miss out on, really? I mean, does the world really need another spectacular sunrise photo? I mean, it's as spectacular as it was. There's been billions, since then. What was that one photo going to do for me? Was it going to make me? Was it going to break me? Was I going to be famous? No. It's so what? It's one photo. Why does it matter that you have to get photos all the time? For me, part of it was another book I had read by John Shaw on the business of landscape photography that came out before digital, when stock agencies were, the big way of making money. And he says in that book, it's volume. When you said to stock company, you need to produce like 10,000 really good quality photos a year. And so that stuck in my head. It's like, I need to produce a lot, And so I think that's where a lot of that results oriented. I needed to produce photos. I didn't have the luxury of just having nice experiences. I had to make work. And so it took me a long time to realize, well, the stock agency model's pretty much dead. So it didn't have to be like that. Now I realize, I could go a year without making a new photo, and that would not affect my, I guess, photography business at all. It would certainly affect my mood, but it's just not necessary. I don't have to. I'm not a National Geographic photographer. I don't have a quota to hit. There shouldn't be that pressure. So, I mean, yes, when I'm out in nature and I do come home with a really strong photo, yes, that does enhance the experience. There's no doubt about that. But I should just as often, sometimes the camera doesn't come out of the bag, and it's like, well, that was a nice walk. I'm fine. There's nobody asking for a photo from me. I don't have to make one. So just enjoy the time out in nature. And it's also time to think, right? And use that time. Sometimes I do write articles, and not just blog, but articles for magazines. And so I may not make a photo, but maybe I thought of a good article idea. Create another creative output. So the photo is it's a bonus, but not the point.
Yes, that's one thing I say to people all the time now is the photograph is just an added bonus. It's all about the experience, and you're definitely kind of reflecting that back there, which is beautiful. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of that now as well. They're realising actually like just being out. Yeah, just being outdoors, isn't it? It does so much for us, and it makes us feel so much positive things, and it just gets us out the house, gets us moving, and allows us to, if we want to take our camera out and connect, because that's one thing I found when I began photography is I missed so much beauty because I spent the whole time stuck behind my camera. And you used the example there of like a nice sunrise, sunset, you're constantly stuck behind the camera, firing off images, trying to capture it in its most beautiful essence, but actually just standing back, watching it unfold before you, and maybe taking one photograph as a memory or whatever. That is where the joy comes from, not the stress of like, oh my gosh, this is going to be over in like 5 minutes. I have to get an image of it.
Well, I think, the camera can work both ways. It can help you connect with nature, but it can also be a barrier to you connecting with nature. Because you see something, but then you get so concerned with making a photograph of it that you're no longer really experiencing what's going on in front of you. You're not just taking in the scene and hearing the sounds and taking in the scents. Your mind switches from, God, this is gorgeous, look at this, or I'm going to make a photo. I think there's a Susan Sontag quote in her book, on photography, where she says something like, it reduces the experience to a souvenir. And that's true. So it can work both ways. It can help you connect with nature, but it can also be a third wheel. Just like for me, when I'm in nature, I work solitary. I don't want another photographer around because it interrupts my, for lack of a better term, communion with nature, The camera can sometimes do that. It can be that barrier as opposed to being a connector. So I guess it just depends on the frame of mind, the state of mind, and also the situation. So.
There's some very deep wisdom there in what you just shared. That's very beautiful that you've got yourself into this state of mind that can allow you to do that as well, because I think a lot of people just really struggle with that, but it's beautiful that you see that as like, that kind of communion with nature, that connection. And I think there's a beautiful bit on your website that says, my goal is not to document literal appearances, but rather make photographs that are a creative expression of my emotional response inspired by the subject. So emotion plays a really big part in how you create your images. How do you go about allowing your emotion to then, I guess, inspire you to create the images you end up going on to make?
I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think, emotion, I think is, from day one, that played the role in making photos. You see a beautiful scene and I wanted to capture it. I think the difference now versus perhaps 20 years ago, things were more literal. My photographs are much more literal than they are now. But the emotion was there. I was emotionally moved by the beauty of the scene. I think now it's seeing things, noticing things differently, noticing things I would not have noticed, more subtle, ordinary things. I think if you look at my website, most things I photograph are quite ordinary, mundane scenes in nature. And then, before I was making more documentary type, literal photographs. And now I think when I say, that reflect my experience, it's just my way of seeing those ferns and then seeing in my head, what I see what they are to my eyes, but I can also imagine what that could be, in a photograph. So it's really just, I say it's objective reality filtered through me, my eyes, my mind, my heart, through my emotions, right? And so what comes out is a photograph that's my own inner reality as opposed to objective reality, I guess you could say. So much of it is, it's funny you asked that question. I don't have a good answer because I think so much of it, and I think you would agree, it comes down to instinct and intuition. You don't think, you just react. You see something and it's not like you're just floating outside your body, you're conscious, but you're not questioning it, well, sometimes you are, I am, but, but it's just, I don't know. You just, if there's a meaning behind the photograph, we talk about symbolism and metaphor and all that, that's for other people. Sometimes mine are an obvious metaphor for something. Most of the time, it's just my reaction, the photograph that you see, the image that you see after processing and everything is just, I don't know, it's just my way of rendering that, the subject matter. And just, anyway.
Yeah.
It's an expression.
Yeah,
right? I guess that's what it's self-expression. But I can't, it's hard for me to put it into words, like I said. So I think emotion, it's always played a role. That's why we make photographs, because we're emotionally moved to, we don't photograph things that bore us, or don't wow us, So it's just a move from objective representation to more subjective, I guess.
I think it's interesting because I think as humans we're always wanting to rationalize things, but actually when we get into that kind of flow and that feeling, like we just know, it's just like you can't put it into words because it almost doesn't have words. But it's interesting to try and hear people try and piece things together, because it's like we all feel it but we can't quite articulate it. And I love that you spoke there about portraying your reality in your images, because I spoke to somebody last week who's quite a philosophical and spiritual person, and she was saying we all have our own reality. Every single person's reality is different, and that's, I think, one of the traps people fall into in photography. They're trying to create what they maybe feel they should or what they've been told is good, but actually if you look at it from the artistic expression perspective, your reality is different to everybody else's reality. So creating images that that work alongside your reality and what you're seeing and how you're perceiving the world is the truest, most authentic way to go out there and express yourself. And it gives you so much more as well, personally, from a feeling, creative, connection perspective. And that's very clear in what you're saying and with your work there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's right. I think, you're getting into about personal vision, right? And we all already have our vision. It's just who we are. It's not about finding it. I think the challenge is having it come through authentically in your photographs. And there's so many ways or so many things that get in the way of that. Maybe this is what people will like. They like these kind of photos, but not these kinds. So I'm going to do that. Camera club competitions or competitions in general. You create for other reasons or other people. And so there's lots of things that can get in the way of, I think, authentically expressing yourself. Because then it becomes that, I never really suffered through fear of rejection, but I think the more personal your work is, you will have perhaps a smaller audience than if you travel to nothing but gorgeous places and made gorgeous, obvious photographs, right? They're going to, because those kinds of photographs will resonate with everybody to a point. But if you make really personal work, then it's going to connect with people who share your sensibilities. But there's going to be plenty of other people who just don't get it or just, And so be it, Now, in the business side of photography, that has ramifications. So, yeah, you just have to, come to grips with that and terms with that and decide if you can, there's some things I'll compromise on, there's some things I won't. And authentic creation and creativity is something I won't compromise on. I create for myself and nobody else, and the chips will fall where they may. Then again, it's not like it's not like my photography is so groundbreaking and just so, oh my God, he's really taking huge chances. I could be more experimental. I could try new things. I always try to, but, it's just creating for you. And hopefully it connects.
Yes. I guess the more authentic and true we are to ourselves, the more likely I feel we are to connect with people on a deeper level. Because I guess when we're photographing these landscapes you were referring to there, which might connect with more people initially, actually it doesn't connect with them on such a deep level. I find when you're creating work that's truly genuine and authentic to you and you've put a lot of emotion into it, yes, you might connect with a smaller kind of scope of people, but actually that connection is so much deeper than what these kind of images you see plastered everywhere is. And like the business side of things is a very interesting thing to think about there, I guess. And so from your perspective, from your business, do you earn most of your money through doing workshops and writing articles and things?
I do, yeah. On the creative side. Now, to supplement that, I do also, like in the nicer, fairer months, I do real estate photography too. Just photographing homes and properties, commercial work, right? And I used to hate to admit that because I felt like I was, I don't know, less of a photographer. But then, hey, Ansel Adams had to do commercial work most of his career, So, there's just practical matters that have to come in. But, I would rather do that than make more accessible, personal work that sold more. You know what I'm saying? Because I separate the two. Now it can be more, my creative work can be geared, it's just for me. I'm doing it for me. If it sells, fantastic. If it doesn't, oh well, that's just the way it is, as far as selling my work goes. But yeah, workshops though on the creative side are certainly a big part of it. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's nice that you've got that almost mix there and you can kind of segregate there between your kind of creative love and joy and what you do with that and, like you say, supplementing it with the commercial elements. And I think it's really interesting with your work as well because you pretty much always photograph in your local region. You don't tend to travel and stuff like you've already said. But how, I guess from your perspective, what is it about getting to know your local region and connect with it that means so much to you in your creative expression?
I used to, I love to travel. I haven't done much of it in recent years. Part of that was pandemic, of course. Part of it's finances. Since I became a professional landscape photographer. Professional only meaning that I do it, for a living, in 2017. And so, there was a reduction in finances coming in. I mean, I am married. My wife has a full-time job, thank goodness. So I wouldn't be able to do this if it were not for her. But even still. But, I noticed that when I would take a trip somewhere, and it was usually some national park, I'd come home with photos, but, it was superficial impressions of this place because it's brand new. I think we all know, right? We don't photograph a place particularly well the first time we visit it, right? We go back and then it's just like you see it better and you see it better. And so I realized that, well, if I see it better on the third time, then maybe I'll see it even better the 50th time I've gone there. And I noticed that around the places close to home, my, state parks close to where I live, or nature preserves, or just county parks, But it took me a while to realize that, I lived away for a long time, moved back to my hometown back in 2007, and there's a state park really close to me. And so for the first few years I had moved back, I went there often, made lots of photos, but then I stopped going because I thought I'd photographed it. I found I was setting the tripod in the same place, making the same kind of composition, I foolishly thought that there was nothing else to see there. Well, then after this epiphany I had in 2015, I went back and started seeing it new. I started noticing things I had never noticed before. Subtleties, nuances, ordinary things. I wasn't just looking for a spectacular sunrise with reflections in the lake, and all this business. And so once I realized that, long story short, the better you know a place, the deeper you see it, the more well you see it, the more you notice things. So I found I was making my most creative, most personally rewarding photographs from the places I could visit most frequently. Yes, part of that was because, I was seeing it in the most kind of variety of conditions, right? I can go there often. So all seasons, all different types of light. And that's part of it. But also, it went deeper than that. It was just, I was noticing things I'd walked by, 40 times before. But this time, I noticed it, And so it's just that getting better at seeing and noticing things. And so, it was just, I could travel somewhere that was more visually stunning and spectacular and stay there for several days and come home and make some nice photos. But then I could go out then to my local park and then in a half hour make a photo that I was more proud of than anything I just made at that other place, because I didn't know that other place as deeply or as well. And so that was a discovery of mine. So, I think, if you really want to make, very creative and very, well-seen photographs, you have to have a familiarity with the place,
Yeah.
But it's a trade-off. It's exciting. It's exciting to go to new places. Sometimes I'm bored. Sometimes I don't, because it's like I have been there 1,000 times before. So, it's so there's a bit of a trade-off. So it's good to have a mix, of course. But anyway, it was just it was an interesting discovery, which I guess seems obvious in retrospect, but.
I guess, but I think there's so many people who obviously love the travel aspect of photography and who go around the world almost with a bucket list of photographing places that they want to go. And I guess they use photography as a means to travel and the reason for travel. But yeah, it's funny because I've not done much travelling myself, but I have around Scotland, where I'm based. I used to go away a lot just to the islands and the west coast, and I would never come back with images I was happy with. And I used to feel really disheartened because I'd be like, I've just spent all this money and this week away at these locations, and
you feel you have to
why
justify
am I
it.
not liking these images? Yeah, exactly. And I used to just be so disheartened when I came back. And a bit like you, I'd go down to my local beach and, make an image quite that I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But as you say, you build up that connection. And I love that you spoke there about the fact that in your local area you can walk past something like 50 times and not notice it, and one day you do notice it, whether it's because it looks a bit different, because of the light, because of the weather, or because I guess your mental thought is somewhere else that day. But the good thing about local, I think, is you start noticing the small things as well. Like you say, you're not just looking for the reflections and the sunrises and the light, you're looking for you start to look at everything, and suddenly
Exactly.
opportunities become available everywhere. And do you
Exactly.
find that with you, that you photograph so many things now that you would never have thought of
Oh,
photographing before?
oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes. I photograph things now that 10 years ago I would have thought, there's nothing there, you know. Um, and there's several reasons for that. But yeah, it's depth of seeing, but also realizing what can be. Again, going back, you know, prior to 2015, I was basing everything on how it looked to my eyes, it's, the literal objective appearance of it. But now, with not only composition, but of course processing or post-processing, you can make that into something completely different, So being able to see what can be, and I tell people in my workshops, don't just see it for what it is, see it for what it can be, according to you, your sensibilities and how you feel about it, You can totally transform it. Yes, it looks boring as is, but boy, add some contrast, convert it to black and white, and holy cow, it just, 5 minutes of post-processing, and you can turn that thing into something, a work of art, And so I think realizing the potential and not just being beholden to it's pretty at the time,
Yeah. So what do you find now in your work? What sort of things really grab your attention now when you're out walking, and that make you want to get that camera out the bag and take an image?
I think, I've started doing over the last, again, 7-8 years, a lot of black and white photography. Probably, I don't know, 60-70% of my work is black and white now. When you think of the visual elements, line, shape, form, color, color is the one that least interests me now. I'm more interested in the details of line and shape and form. So those are the things I tend to notice. Contrast, and to bring out and emphasize in photographs. And I often find color, when I'm, looking at something, if I see something that catches my eye, whether I ask it to myself consciously or subconsciously, is color playing a role here? Oftentimes, no. It may have color, maybe a group of ferns that are a really pretty vibrant shade of green, but I don't see the green. What I'm seeing is the shapes and the textures, and the lines. If there's different shades of green, I'm seeing the differences in tonality. However, if I keep it in color, people are going to notice color because that's what most people notice first, especially people who aren't used to looking at photographs, right? So I'm going to take the color out of there because that's not what I'm responding to. I'm responding to something else. So yeah, it's details. I mean, I live in the Northeast, and this is not the West or Western United States, where it's grand, just magnificent, mind-blowing landscapes. The Northeast is a different beast. It's beautiful. It's more subtle. There's a quote from Harry Callahan, who was one of my favorite photographers and inspiration. He was from Michigan. He said, "Michigan, nothing is spectacular." He was being somewhat, facetious in that. He was comparing it to like Ansel Adams and Yosemite. Compared to that, there is nothing spectacular. So what he photographed were reeds, and grasses. But he did something really special with them, and so he's one of my biggest, sources of inspiration and influences because he just photographs stuff, and that's the kind of stuff I see around here. So it was stuff like that, seeing his work and others who have done work in this part of the country, of the U.S., that, it's like, oh, well, they photographed these kinds of woods and these kinds of scenes, but look at the stuff they noticed and look what they could do with it. It's like, well, I can do that too. And so that's a huge part, a big point, and I stress that in my workshops is, look at lots of great photographs, not just contemporary, but also the history of it, and find those photographers whose work really speaks to you. Ask yourself why it speaks to you. Or maybe you don't have to, it just speaks to you. And then incorporate those elements in your own work if you can. Don't copy, but incorporate, And so more than anything, my change in seeing, going back to your original question, of noticing things I never would have noticed before. One of the big reasons I notice those things now is because I've learned what can be done by looking at the work of people who went before me and seeing, and also contemporary photographers as well. And so nothing is 100% original. Every creative work builds on what came before it. So, I see those photographers. I have a group of photographers that really inspire me, whose work inspired me. And, all right, and now I'm going to try to use, that in my own photography. And that's the real challenge, right? To not imitate, but incorporate.
Yeah, definitely. I love that you made reference there to how there's... Yeah, exactly. And I love how you made reference there to how almost like nothing is almost, I guess, unique in many ways, because we take inspiration from other people and we might not realise it. We might think we've created something different, but actually something somewhere got into your subconscious mind that allowed you to create that image. And I also love there when you spoke about when you're editing your images, you always think about what was it that made you take the image in the first place. Was it the textures? Was it the patterns? How did you really emphasise that in your image and your final creation? Because that's one thing I see in a lot of people. If you sit somebody down with their images, they'll explain to you why they photographed it, but then how they've gone on to process the image, it doesn't always showcase that subject in the way that they envisaged it. And it's like, okay, that subject's so far away. You've got so much before it. It's interesting to hear that, because I think that's what often makes photographers stand out, is when they're clear what made you take that image in the first place, and then you ensure that your final image showcases what enticed you in there in the first place. So
exactly.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess because books have been such an inspiration for you, one thing I think we'll kind of end on here is, have you ever created a book yourself or considered creating one?
I did one 2 years ago, self-published just through Blurb. It's just one of the more popular self-publishing books. And it was a last-minute decision. It came together really quickly and easily. And it's just a small, 8x10 photography book. Not much writing in it. It's just a collection. And why I did it when I did it, so I live in an area called the Thousand Islands. It's my favorite area. And so it's on that, through the seasons, But because my photography has changed in recent years rather dramatically, I kind of wanted to put together a collection of photographs that kind of put, I guess, the old me to bed. These are photographs I made over the past 15 years, and there's a mixture. There's photographs in there that are very objective and literal and kind of wide angle type scenes I don't do anymore, and then there's scenes that are much more creative. It's all color. I didn't want to mix black and white and color, so I had to leave out a lot of my favorite photographs because they're black and white. I don't know. It just it was coming out of a long winter. It was March, which is like the worst month for nature photography in this corner of the world, and had time, and so let's do this. And it was nice to do. I don't know about you, but anytime I put something together, whether it's an exhibit of my work, and I've done several over the years, you immediately find fault. You're never... at the time I really liked it, but now I look back at it and I don't know. I'm very harsh against... I think
we're all our own worst critic.
We are. Well, it's like I like individual photos, but when I pull a bunch together and I just find, fault. Anytime I've done an exhibit, it's like I'm going to pull all these images together, and then when I see them all on the wall, I'm like, it's just terrible. And anyway, I guess you're right. We all act like that, I suppose. But so yes, I have one book, and it was fun to do. I would like to start doing more ebooks as a way of just sharing photos. There's a photographer who I saw who just put together an ebook of photos from like the past fall, and she made it available for free, but it looked great. And it's a great way to share your work, so much better than posting on Instagram or Facebook. And I was like, that's a fantastic idea. And so it's just a nice way to, because you want to share your work, you want others to see it. I'm just no longer on Facebook and Instagram, so I can no longer share on a daily basis, which is actually a good thing for me.
Yeah. They've got their pros and cons, don't they? Social media. Sometimes it's great, and other times it consumes your life. Sometimes it's just...
it can. It's an individual decision. It depends on the person, and it was just right for me to end that. Get myself off of there. But that's okay.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, if it works for you, that's fantastic. It's
Well,
good
exactly
that you had
right.
the strength to do that. So yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chris.
Oh,
It's
thank
been
you,
an
Kim. I
absolute
appreciate
pleasure
it.
to speak with you. If
No, I
anyone would
appreciate
like to see your work or get in touch with you, where would be the best place to find you?
They can go to my website, which is chrismurrayphotography.com. Yeah, like I said, go there. You can sign up for my newsletter. You can sign up for my blogs. I'm a regular contributor on Landscape Magazine, which you probably are familiar with.
Okay, yeah.
So I do, 4 articles for them each year. But yeah, mainly through my website. Yeah.
Brilliant.
And
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Well, thank you, Kim.
Great.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this week's podcast. It really does mean the world to me. If you'd like to get further involved with the Photographic Connections community, you can find all the details at photographicconnections.com. And now that this podcast has come to an end, there's only one thing left for you to do. It's time to pick up your camera and head outdoors. There's so many incredible photographic opportunities just waiting for you to discover.